Eric Klinenberg is a professor of social science and the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He is the author of Palaces for the People: How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago. He is also the editor of Cultural Production in a Digital Age, co-editor of Anti-Democracy in America, and co-author with Aziz Ansari of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Modern Romance, which he just told us today has been banned in the state of? In a district of Missouri. His scholarly work has been published in journals including the American Sociological Review, Theory and Society, and Ethnography, and he has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and This American Life. Please, Williamsburg, help me welcome Eric Klinenberg.
Thank you all. I'm actually going to go up on stage, but this is such a great podium. I just had to stand there. If any of you know my mother, could you get a photograph, please, and send it to her? It would mean a lot to my family.
Okay, wait a second.
Oh, okay. She didn't tell me she knew my mother. I was wondering why they picked my book for the One Community thing here. So, thank you. That's great. This is such a surreal experience for me. It used to be such a mundane experience, and now, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm actually in a room with other live human beings on a stage. We're in something like a theater together, an auditorium together. How's the sound? I'm hearing an echo. Yeah, it's okay? Good. I haven't done this in a while. I haven't, actually the last time I did this was March, oh, there it is, that's the problem, right? March 9th, 2020. So last time I was on a stage, and it was, I'll take that. Yeah, it was 1 minute. And Palaces for the People was the one book, one community read for Cuyahoga County, which includes Cleveland in Ohio. And we were at the big auditorium, the main theater in Cleveland, and it has 2,500 seats, and they had sold out 2,500 seats. And on the weekend, I called and I said, I don't know if you've heard about this pandemic thing. It's coming through New York. It's pretty bad where I live, actually, and people are freaking out. Are you sure you want to do this event? And they said, definitely we want to do this event. You should definitely come. We have no COVID here at all. And I said, you know that's because you're not testing, right? They're like, no, it doesn't. So I get there. There were 3 people on the flight, and we didn't have masks. Nobody had a mask. And I arrived at like 9. I got the early flight, and I got there at 9 in the morning. And I went to the hotel, and the first thing I did is I went to the Cleveland CVS because they hadn't figured out that you had to buy all the like cough medicine stuff. So I went and I bought this. I'm not kidding here. I bought Tylenol. I bought zinc drops. I bought all this crazy stuff, and then I packed my bag, and then I went to the hotel. And that day, the stock market crashed like 1,200 points. They had 3 positive cases of COVID in Cleveland, and 300 people came to my talk. And that would, 300 would be good on most nights, but 300 in a 2,500 person theater feels different. And we did it, and this is the first time I've been on a stage since then. So I can't tell you how great it is to be here. Thank you. Yeah, it's really unbelievably nice because what happened is so we did the thing. I didn't get COVID. When I got home, I think my son did have COVID, and we just retreated. And the reason we retreated is because the World Health Organization started to say, the way you're going to survive this pandemic is you're going to be socially distant. Do you remember that? We all got told, it's time to be socially distant. I'm guessing, have any of you been socially distant the last couple of years? Yeah, there's been a lot of social distance in our lives, right? And I have to tell you, I heard that idea, I heard that, request, command, whatever it was, guideline, be socially distant. And I understood what the World Health Organization was trying to say, and then states all over the world were saying it. I got the message, I understood. But I also thought, that is absolutely the wrong message for this moment. So social distance. It's the wrong message. And the reason it's the wrong message is not because I'm a COVID denier. It's that social distance doesn't actually get you any safety in a pandemic. You know what protects your health and life in a pandemic is physical distance, right? You don't want somebody coughing on you. You don't want someone sneezing on you. You don't want someone singing in your vicinity, we learned, right? You don't want loud talking. Even laughter got a little bit scary, which is what's been so hard for us, right? All these things that make life great suddenly became sources of danger. Even breathing, right, became hard. But that's not social proximity, that's physical proximity. That's the danger. And actually, the message of social distancing told us, you know how we're going to get through this? You need to go to your home and close the door. Take care of yourself. Take care of your people in your immediate family, and everyone's just going to be on their own, and we're going to handle this on their own. And that seemed totally wrong because, there were people who needed prescription drugs. There were people who didn't know how to use Zoom or FaceTime or Skype or use other technologies that could keep them connected. There were people who didn't have food. There were people who we relied on. We turned them into essential workers. Remember that category, essential workers? We forgot about that, but we called them essential workers. And so what we needed to provide all of that stuff for each other, all the care that helps a society get through a pandemic, that's social solidarity, right? And social solidarity matters, the way we look out for each other. If you live in a society where you invest in public education, and you say everyone here needs to have some basic knowledge in order to function in our society, then it's much harder for people to make the mistake of confusing the ordinary flu with a novel coronavirus that's potentially lethal, right? If you can do a good job with education, then people get the difference, right? If you live in a society with social solidarity, you protect workers. So if you work in the food industry and you're sick, you don't worry that if you don't go to work that day, you're going to lose your job, right? But you do worry that if you live in the United States because people who have those jobs are in a pretty precarious situation. And we know that sick people go to work more in the United States than they do in other countries like the United States because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And that's a failure of social solidarity. And stuff like whether the people who are going to work and giving you food are sick or healthy matters a lot in a pandemic, right? You can't survive a pandemic on your own. The pandemic has taught us that our fate is tied to the fate of everybody around us, right? There's no such thing as a bubble, really. You can only seal yourself off so much. So imagine what it would have been like if the message that we got from the World Health Organization, from governments around the country and the world was physical distance, social solidarity. Physical distance, social solidarity, right? It would have been a different couple of years. We would have been a little less afraid of each other, I think, right? A little bit less judgmental. You've done it. You've been out in public and you've seen someone do something that you don't agree with and you give them that mean look, right? We turned into kind of the worst versions of ourselves these last couple of years because we were told, be distant. But it's time for that to be over. Right? So tonight, it's a difficult day. It's not been the best day. But here, at least we're here. Right? At least we're here. So take a second, look around. Maybe some of you haven't been out in a long time. These are other human beings. These are your neighbors. You You made it. You made it this far. And maybe it's time for a little less social distance and a little bit more solidarity. And actually, yeah, I think, so that turns out to be a thing that I've been thinking about a lot these last couple of years. Like, what is this thing, solidarity, and how do we build it? And that's a very different thing than polarization and division and all the stuff that we've been hearing about. And I've been thinking about these issues because I recognize that we remain in the midst of a crisis. And I don't see how we get out of this crisis. And crisis is too simple a term because it's actually kind of a set of crises that are smashing into each other. And I don't see how we get out of it without developing some capacity to be together, right? That capacity to support one another, to have a shared project, from the most basic kind of thing like checking in on our neighbors to the most difficult thing like disagreeing about something fundamental and being able to be in a room and talk about it and not want to kill each other, right? And tonight's a night where we're learning, yeah? So there are people in this predicament sometimes wind up killing each other. And I hate to say this in colonial Williamsburg, but we're closer to that state than we want to be right now, unfortunately. We're closer to that kind of violence towards each other than we want to be. We're not there, but it's not the best of times for democracy. So the reason that I'm here tonight, the reason I said, I'm going to come for the first time in 2 years and do this thing in person, is because this seems like the right place to have that conversation. How do we start to rebuild? How do we think about the shared project? How do we think about forging the kind of society that we're going to need to deal with, pandemics and an assault on democracy and the ongoing catastrophe of racial inequality and the climate crisis that we're barreling into, right? What are we going to do? The most basic thing we need to be able to do is knock on each other's door and make sure we're okay. And the whole career of my work on this issue of solidarity, connection, and disconnection comes from the first project I ever did. I grew up in the city of Chicago, right downtown, and in 1995, just before I was about to start graduate school in sociology, there was this massive heat wave that hit Chicago, and it killed 700 some people in just a couple of days. It killed like 739 people in just a couple of days. Now, once upon a time, you would hear 739 people died in 2 days, and that was a big deal. You'd think like, wow. One of the weird things about this moment is like 2,000 people died of COVID yesterday. And I'm still trying to reconcile my feelings about the fact that we seem to be kind of numb to those numbers, where there's a lot of reckoning that we're going to have to do, hopefully together. But it was a big deal. It caught my eye, this 700 some deaths in my home city, which is famously a kind of a city of neighborhoods, a city that prides itself on community ties. And I wanted to understand what happened. And I went back to Chicago, and I kind of started making these maps to see who died and where they died. And when I first looked at the map, it looked kind of uninteresting. It looked politically really important because you could see when you drew the map that the neighborhoods that had really high death rates were the clusters of segregated black, very poor neighborhoods on the south side and the west side. And it was politically important to register that because it raised the question, if you knew that was going to happen, if you knew that those places were likely to suffer, why didn't you do more to protect life there? But it wasn't scientifically very interesting because it's what you would have predicted, right? You don't win a Nobel Prize for saying when a disaster comes to a big American city, the most vulnerable people are going to be the hardest hit, right? So still no Nobel Prize for me. But no, but it's going to get better. Don't worry. I'm going to get myself into contention soon in this lecture. So the thing that changed my career, actually, the thing that really kind of set me off on this journey to thinking about these issues and to understanding how social life works and what conditions allow people to support each other and build something bigger, is that I did a second look at the map and I noticed something that no one had seen before, which is that there was this puzzle. And the puzzle was, there were a bunch of neighborhood clusters in Chicago where you had like the same demographic makeup of neighborhoods that were separated by a street. And like imagine that you've got two neighborhoods here, and we'll call this one Auburn Gresham, and we'll call this one Englewood in Chicago, and they're both on the south side, and they're both almost entirely black, and they're both disproportionately poor, have a lot of older people, and they're separated by this street. And there are a bunch of clusters like this, these pairs of neighborhoods. And you go over to Englewood, and Englewood had lost about half of its population in the years going up to the heat wave, the decades before then. When you walked around the streets of Englewood, it felt depleted, abandoned. There were all these empty lots and abandoned houses. There weren't a lot of like diners and grocery stores and coffee shops, community organizations. The parks were in bad shape. This thing I came to call the social infrastructure was really hollowed out. And as a consequence, the people who live in Englewood, especially the older people who had what we now call underlying conditions, they were more likely to just kind of hunker down at home. And as a result of that, social life was a little more private. It's not that it didn't exist. And when the heat wave came to Chicago, because life was basically private in the home, people didn't necessarily know that they had neighbors who were really old and really sick and who were stuck in their homes. And it turned out that they got very isolated. And Englewood was one of the deadliest places you could be in Chicago, like one of the horrible high death rate in Chicago. Literally across the street, literally across the street, same demographic profile, right? This neighborhood, Auburn Gresham, does not have this same loss of population. Despite the poverty, despite the segregation, it's got a pretty robust street life. There are shops, diners, local libraries, community organizations, parks in pretty good shape, a lot of stoops, and people have a tendency to live their lives outside much more. We're used to bumping into our neighbors over here, and so if Tammy doesn't go out of her house, you're used to seeing Tammy most days, and so you knock on the door. It's not because you live in, don't congratulate yourself, Auburn Gresham people over here. I can see you getting confident. These are good people here in Englewood, right? These are really good people. They have to, the nature of their neighborhood makes them live their lives differently. They organize their social life differently because of the way they live in the neighborhood, because of the social infrastructure of the neighborhood. They don't really know whose door to knock on. Over here, you're used to seeing each other because the social infrastructure in your neighborhood encourages this kind of public life. And so all the Tammys in the neighborhood have someone come and knock on their door. And Auburn Gresham, despite having every reason in the world to be one of the deadliest places in Chicago this week, if I just showed you the statistics, you would say that place is going to be in terrible shape. One of the lowest death rates in the city, even lower death rate than in the fancy neighborhoods on the north side, right? In fact, you're 10 times less likely to die in the heat wave than they are in Englewood. And the amazing thing I learned when I finished doing this thing on the heat wave is that life expectancy on this side of the auditorium is 5 years longer than it is over here. 5 years longer. And you can't say it's because of race. You can't say it's because of class. You can't say it's because of age, because they're the same, right? And so I could tell from my research that what was driving the difference was this thing I call social infrastructure. So when I say social infrastructure, actually when I wrote about it in the book, it was not really a concept that we had in the United States. Now we actually have it as a concept in politics, which is wild for me. But when I say social infrastructure, I'm referring to something very specific, the physical places that shape our interactions. Okay, social infrastructure, it's not a metaphor. All right, it's like in the same way that there's an infrastructure for water, there's an infrastructure for transportation, there's an infrastructure for communication, there's an infrastructure for energy. There's an infrastructure, this kind of built environment that supports social life. And what I've come to believe, and this is the kind of big argument of this book that hopefully you at least have. Maybe you've opened. And in my fantasy life, some of you have read it. Social infrastructure, when we invest in it, when we build it well, when we design it well, when we maintain it, maintenance is big. I grew up in Chicago in the 70s and 80s. We were very bad on maintenance. A lot of playgrounds that were built, in the 50s and 60s that had glass on the floors. A lot of libraries that were closed, didn't have open hours like they used to because we didn't maintain them. And especially when you program social infrastructure, when you program them, you get all these returns to collective life. If you really do social infrastructure, you create a place where the life expectancy is longer, where the quality of everyday life is better, where people are more likely to support each other, where people are more likely to be able to solve problems collectively. And in the reverse, if you live in a place where you neglect your social infrastructure, you don't put money into it, you don't build the new library that everyone knows you need to build, you don't maintain the things you got, you don't invest in programming, now we start to hunker down like the folks in the middle section over here, right? We get a little more isolated, a little bit more likely to live our lives on our screens. It's this incredibly powerful thing, social infrastructure. And the most important thing that could happen tonight is that you walk away really understanding this idea and why it matters for us and how it's connected to that first thing I talked about, which is the importance of being together and the problem with social distance. So I wrote this book about the heat wave in Chicago, and actually it was very cool. Last week, this is kind of like it's my coming out party this month, because last week I went to Europe. I went to Paris, where they just translated heat wave into French after 20 years. And yeah, this is like by far the most applause I've had in years. So I'm it's like, forgotten how you do that even. But they translated the book, and I got to go to Europe and talk about heat wave, and it was weird to hear. Like I hadn't thought about all the connections between the heat wave project and this idea. But I wrote this book, and I moved to New York City soon after and started working in New York. And then Hurricane Sandy hit. Remember Sandy in 2012? It's been a tough run, hasn't it, for us? God. So Sandy happened, and I wrote this article in the New Yorker about how the city broke down, and I brought up the problems with the hard infrastructure, the kind of traditional critical infrastructure in the city, and I also wrote a lot about social infrastructure. And a few weeks later, I got a email out of the blue from the Obama administration. Remember the Obama administration? It's like a very different time in American history, yeah. And they said, you might remember this, Congress had just passed a $50 billion relief bill for the states that were damaged by Sandy, and there's a lot of damage from Sandy. And they had set aside a couple $1 billion to do this thing they were calling the Rebuild by Design competition, and the idea was that they wanted to come up with innovative design concepts and actual innovative design plans, projects for the region affected by Sandy. The notion is that there are all these kind of 21st century problems that were coming, and FEMA regulations, when you do ordinary funding, say you can't build something better than what you had before, because the federal government's very suspicious of local government in this country, and so the notion was you didn't want to like create an incentive for local governments to game the system by upgrading their systems. And so we literally have a rule that you can't build something better than what you had before, which made sense in the Holocene maybe a little bit, but now that we've entered into this new period where the waters are getting higher and the heat is coming, you can only rebuild the same structure to have it only to get it flooded out so many times. So the Obama administration came up with this idea of doing something different, and they were able to set aside some money, and they asked me to be the research director for this project, which is an amazing experience. There was this 9-month process where all the design teams that were finalists, there were 148 teams from around the world that entered the competition. There are 10 finalists. They included some of the great architects of our time, like Rem Koolhaas and Bjarke Ingels and the major engineering firms, and it was a very exciting thing. And they had this 9-month process that involved 3 months of research and 3 months of like stakeholder meetings, and then the 3 months of participatory design, and then they went to the jury. And a couple $1 billion were on the line. So that for the teams, it was a very big deal, right? Like a lot of money and maybe the opportunity to shape one of the world's most iconic landscapes. So it was a lot of pressure. And I was working with these teams, and I had this amazing experience once where there was one design team that has done amazing work in other parts of the country, and they were struggling to come up with an idea that was inspiring enough to get, potentially $1 billion. There's a lot of money up there. I know that you got a lot of money down here, but they're showing me the plans for your new library you got. It's $500 million for a new library for Williamsburg is amazing. No, that's not happening. So they showed me. We were talking about their project, and they had really been stuck because pressure. And then finally they had this breakthrough. And we were walking together, and they said, "Eric, we've got this amazing idea. We've come up with the plans for a prototype for a new kind of building, which we think is going to be just totally amazing. It's going to work for this one town that we're designing it for, but we actually think it's going to be replicable throughout the country, around the world. And we're calling it a resilience center." And I said, "Wow, that sounds really interesting. Like, can you tell me about it?" And they said, "Yes. Like, imagine a building that's like in a community or neighborhood, and it's designed to be like a home away from home, like a second home for everybody there. It's a public building. It's open 5, 6, 7 days a week. Doors are always open. It's staffed by these resilience professionals, whose job is to be like aggressively welcoming. It's like open the door, make sure everyone knows they can come in." And they said, the resilience center is there for everybody, but we know that people who are really rooted in the neighborhood, who spend the most time in the neighborhood, are older people and younger people. And so we want to make sure that we have programs especially catered for those populations. And they said, young people obviously don't just come to the Resilience Center by themselves. They come with their grown-ups. So we want to set up a whole set of programs, like you would have story time in the morning, and you do like crafts courses, and maybe you do some sing-alongs, right? And then they said, since the kids are going to have grown-ups with them, we would have comfortable furniture, right? Maybe we'd have Wi-Fi access. You could get computers and things like that together. And then they said, for the older people in the community, we want to have current events classes. We could have like movie nights. We could do lectures. We'd really amp up the technology program so that people could learn to do different technology. And the notion is that we'd be here all the time, and therefore people would come, and if there was a crisis, they would know that this is a safe place for them. And they were so excited about this idea. And they asked me, Eric, what do you think? And I've been teaching in universities for 20 years now, so I get people pitching me project ideas all the time, and I know there's a lot of sensitivity involved when you've been working on something for a while and you need to get it vetted by your, authority figure. So I said, I think that's great. Wow, I can see how hard you've been working on this. And then I paused for a second and said, by the way, have you ever heard of a library? Because unwittingly, I think, they had tried to use all of the best ideas we have about how to build community and how to create a public space and how to make people feel like they belong, and by accident reinvented the library. And at first I was kind of frustrated about it because why didn't they know? I mean, the library is everywhere. But then I realized actually they were expressing something that's in the zeitgeist, and certainly was at the time, which is this notion that was later articulated by an economist in a famous article in Forbes magazine. And the notion is that like the library is irrelevant. The library is obsolete. Now that we have Amazon and Kindles and Google and the world of information at our fingertips, who needs library? Actually, this economist, he went on. He said, until I see the cost-benefit analysis that cashes out the value of the library, I suggest that we knock down libraries throughout the country and replace them with Amazon stores. Yeah. And so I had that frustrated. By the way, so this incredible thing happened after that, which is that as soon as I saw that, first when I saw that article, I thought my friends were trolling me online or something. And because I couldn't believe it was real, but it was actually real. But then this amazing thing happened, which is that the librarians of the world united, and they got on Twitter, and they started telling these, they started testifying about all the things that happen in libraries. Like, maybe you don't know this, that libraries do more English as a second language education than any other institution we have in our society. They do occupational training. They do vocational training. A lot of work with people as they get out of the criminal justice system. You might know that we have several million people in and out of the criminal justice system in this country. We have quite the dragnet. And then we have this question, what happens when people are out? And libraries do that. They do more citizenship courses than any other public institution. In New York, where I live, now that a lot of the public schools don't have libraries anymore, so kids go after school to do their research projects at the library. Sometimes they go during school because the library has just become like an appendage to the school district. Of course, they do early literacy. They do all kinds of programming for older people, including older people who live alone and are at risk of isolation, being the people who die in a heat wave. There are places where you go to register to vote. Some towns you can vote in the library. They're where you go to do the census. They do an extraordinary range of things, and basically, like the librarians kind of testified about this, and an incredible thing happened, which is within 24 hours, Forbes actually took that article down off the internet. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, I sometimes like to say that's the only good thing that's ever happened on Twitter. So then I thought about that, and I got really excited. I was like, oh, actually, we do get the value of libraries as social infrastructure. What's a better social infrastructure that represents our core fundamental principles around openness and belonging and democracy? But then I went down again because I did this thought experiment, and would you mind if I do it with you? Could you go up for a little thought experiment with me? All right. So I was you can tell I have these mood swings. I get really happy, and then the pandemic comes. So this is the experiment I want you to do. I want you to imagine for a minute that there was no such thing as the library. Okay, the library does not exist. We are sitting here tonight in the Amazon auditorium. Right? There's no library. And I come to you, and I pitch to you the idea of the library. And we all get really excited about it. And we decide, we're going to go to Richmond in the morning, and we're going to pitch the library to your new governor. Okay? And I'd say we should invite him down to William & Mary, but I hear that could be complicated, so we're just going to, we're going to go to Richmond, we're going to pitch it. Now so here's our pitch. You ready? This is our pitch, okay? Mr. Governor, we have a big idea for you, and that is, we want to tell you about this new thing we've invented called the library. And what we want to do is we would like to build a building in every city, suburb, and town in Virginia. Some places it's going to be really big and grand. Some, it's going to be more modest, built to scale. But they're going to be public buildings. You can get some private money, if you need help building them, but they're going to be public buildings. We want you to staff them with these public sector employees, these creatures we call librarians. Their job is to basically welcome people when they come in and say, how can I help you? Not to judge them, not to surveil them, but just how can I help you? We're going to keep it open 5, 6, 7 days a week. We're going to fill these libraries with all of our cultural heritage, the most important things in our cultural heritage. We'll have books, we'll have magazines, we'll have newspapers, we'll have films, we'll have audiobooks, we'll have computers, laptops, tablets. We'll do English as a second language classes. We'll do all kinds of civic education. Everybody's going to be welcome in the library, regardless of your age, your social class, your race, your ethnicity, even your citizenship status doesn't matter. You're still welcome. You could take stuff out, and we'll just expect that you're going to return it, and to make sure you do that, we're going to use the honor system. One last thing, Mr. Governor. Everything in the library is going to be free. You come in for free, you can take stuff out for free, you bring home a laptop, whatever, it's all going to be free. Okay. How many of you think if we went to the new governor of Virginia, and pitched the idea of the library does not exist? Remember, we're all in Amazon stores right now. How many of you think the governor would be like, that's an amazing idea, let's do it? Raise your hand really high, because I got bright lights here. Just look around. Can you all see? Can someone give me a count on the number of hands there? How many people think this guy's joking? I can tell. We have not a single person in this room thinks that the new governor of Virginia will do that. But you know what's funny? I live in a slightly more liberal state than you, and I have visited many liberal states. I've done this thought experiment, and nobody in any state in the United States of America, with the possible exception of Vermont, where some guy said my senator would do it, nobody thinks that their political leaders would go for that plan. Nobody. Right? Why is that? The reason is because the thing I just pitched to you, that concept of the library that has all that stuff, that might be the most radical idea that's ever been pitched in this building. Think about the principles behind that, the kind of cultural orientation of a society that would do that you'd have it in every town, in every neighborhood of every city. You'd have big ones. Think about the commitment it takes to do that as a society. That's a very radical idea, right? To build a library like that. And the mind-bending thing about this wild and radical idea that I've just pitched to you, that no one in this room, that no one in this country thinks that we could pass if it got pitched today, is that we did it. We have it. We're actually not sitting in an Amazon shop. There's no charge that's going to show up on your credit card because you got scanned when you came in tonight. We are in a library. And if you're like me, the next question in your mind is, how did that happen? How do we do this? It's a really tough, how do we do this? And what have we done since then? And the how do we did this question is a longer story, and I know some of you haven't had dinner yet. But the short of it is, once upon a time, we had an idea that there's a thing called a public good. And that if you want to have a good society, if you want to have a decent society, if you want to have a successful democracy, you can't just have palaces for rich people and the remains for everybody else. You have to invest in these public goods. And that doing that is going to lift everybody up. It's going to create opportunities for people who don't have a lot of them, and it's going to make life a lot better for people who have enough already. And we made a commitment to it. We had a class of philanthropists. Andrew Carnegie was the big guy with respect to building libraries. Not a model human being in every sense of his life, but quite a philanthropist when it came to libraries. And then we had governments, local to federal, that said, this is worth doing. Right? This is worth our collective investment. It's worth our tax dollars. I will spend something from my own pocket to live in a society that has libraries. Right? And remember, a library here it's a symbol. It's a thing, but it's also a symbol because we invested in much more than libraries. But then the tougher question is, what have we done with it? And it's my view that what we have done since that moment of building all of these palaces for the people, and parks and playgrounds, and public schools, athletic fields, largely what we've done in this country is we have squandered our inheritance. We are like the prodigal children who lived off the good things that we inherited, took it for granted, refused to contribute at the level that people did before us, and then got really puzzled about why it feels like society is falling apart, why it feels like the project has come undone, why we're so divided, we can't find common purpose. It's not that much of a mystery, is it, when you think about it? It's not that much of a mystery how those things happen. We had a vision for what it meant to be a good society. It was a vision that involved not just private wealth, but also some sense of public flourishing. It involved access, it involved belonging, it involved a commitment to doing more, to be more equal. And we screwed it up a lot, by the way. We had segregated library systems. We made it clear to some people they weren't welcome in our public spaces. We've never been as equal or even as democratic as we idealized ourselves to be. But we fell off that track. We got socially distant a long time before COVID started. And so it seems to me like the reason to come to Williamsburg for me today is because we're starting to talk seriously about what it means to build a new world. I hope, it's too early to say post-pandemic. I could tell some of you are already post-pandemic. You know? You can see the people in a room who are already post-pandemic. Some of you are like, I'm getting there. But we're here at least, right? We're here. It's kind of cool. I mean, look at all of us. We're here together. By the way, it's raining out. It's cold. A war started today. You all had every reason to stay home tonight, right? You had every reason to just stay home. You could have doom scrolled, right? You could have eaten comfort food. You could have watched Netflix. There's so many good things you could have done tonight, and you're here. And I think you're here for the same reason I am, which because you feel like we're coming out of something. We're starting something different. And as hard of a moment as this is, there's probably never been a better time to be part of a process of rebuilding, because everything's at stake. I mean, decades from now, they'll look back at this moment and they'll say, you know, what did they do in the face of a pandemic and in the face of a crisis of democracy and in the face of a racial equity debate that never seems to get as good as it needs to. And what did they do in anticipation of the climate change that we're feeling now? That's what they're going to be saying a few decades from now. And so I guess the question I want to leave you with and all of us with is, what are we going to do? What kind of commitment are we willing to make? What kind of that person's got more at stake than anybody here in this conversation, by the way. So I mean, right? I mean that's listen to that sound, because it's all about that life, right? And in the same way that we're here because people who came before us gave us a gift, I think now is time for us to think about what kind of world we want to give to that beautiful little baby. So, thank you.
Reader Services Librarian here at the library. My colleague, Alicia, is going to be helping me out during this question and answer period. Couple of things that you need to know: that we are streaming this on Zoom and it is being recorded, which means that your questions need to come through this thing so that he can hear it, so that we can hear it, so that people in the future can hear it. So that being said, and we also have possibly plenty of questions. We'd like to get questions quickly. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Alicia and I will try to make it to you as soon as we can. So does anyone have questions? Alicia, you got one over here.
Thank you for coming here. We really appreciate it. I did read the book. I understand your emphasis on social infrastructure to promote social interactions for the benefit of all of us. But are those spaces alone adequate to promote that interaction? I think back to my own epiphany and understanding when I was a medical student, an intern at Cook County. Michael Reese and the University of Chicago. You're old, not that far away from.
Yeah.
You know, where you?
I was born at Michael Reese, as a matter of fact. So, if that was you, thank you. You look great. You've come a long way. You know, your hands were. I remember your hands were a little unsteady, but.
But that was my epiphany and understanding. Would you support or suggest a year of public service for everyone to actually break down barriers? Because
so thank you for that question. A really important point here, and I say this in the book too. I don't think the space, like you can't just build a space and have everything come from that. And you know, you could. First of all, there are lots of kind of terrific social infrastructures that are built entirely for the production and promotion of inequality. The country club is the best example of that, right? It's great social space, literally designed so that very affluent people, often of the same race or ethnicity or religion, could fraternize with one another and not include other people. So, you know, there are other social spaces that are breeding grounds for even worse behavior. So it's not enough to have the physical space, and certain kinds of physical spaces are especially important. I care a lot about spaces that can work for bridging divisions, and in the book talk a lot about what that means. But I think what you really wanted to ask is about service, and it's a slightly different point than the social infrastructure idea, but it happens to be the case that it's an idea I've thought about a lot and done some work on. And yeah, look, for all of its flaws, like namely that it's organized around the possibility of inflicting violence on other people, the U.S. military is an incredible experience for people who go through it, because it brings people from different walks of life together, and especially on ethnic and racial integration, there's just still no institution in the United States like the military. So people who go through military service have an experience of being with people who are different from them, unfortunately not as much on class grounds anymore, than others do. And so wouldn't it be an amazing thing if we had some kind of national service corps and we got people involved in all the kinds of things that we need help with, from child care to care for older people who are isolated, to kind of a climate corps, to public health, to helping out in libraries. What if we had some kind of mandatory service project, and it brought people from different walks of life together? It's actually hard for me to see the downside of that kind of thing right now. I guess there could be a debate about whether it would be mandatory. But we have a lot of young people who are facing a weird job market where there's some demand, but not necessarily possibilities for the kind of careers that people in previous generations wanted. And you could imagine this being enormously attractive to people. I know that this was high on the agenda for Hillary Clinton. I would not be surprised to see some conversation like that from the Biden administration if they have time. But I think it's an exciting idea, and it could be the kind of idea that happens at the state level too. There could be state programs, so I like it very much.
In your creating social infrastructure, is it only going to be a grassroots effort, or is it something that the state and the federal government can do?
A few weeks ago, there was a $1.5 trillion proposal in the Capitol for building infrastructure and a lot of social infrastructure. And that federal money would have transformed the physical makeup of this country. And I think it's a deep loss to us that we're not going to have that $1.5 trillion expenditure. I do anticipate that there will be more federal money for infrastructure projects, because we just don't have systems that sustain healthy life for the 21st century. We built our cities and suburbs based on 19th century conditions, in some cases 20th century conditions, and those just don't hold anymore. So I think it's inevitable that at some point we will start to build a lot of infrastructure, and now we do have this vocabulary of social infrastructure. So I think we can't do it at the local level, actually. I think it needs to be rooted in federal dollars and at minimum state dollars, but then the local part comes in because there's no real one-size-fits-all infrastructure that you want to just plug into cities and communities. You want towns to be able to participate in the process of figuring out what kinds of systems they need. That's what we try to do with Rebuild by Design. So, the United States has quite a good record of doing projects like that. And the problem sometimes is we can be very slow, and there's a big NIMBY problem, right? There's NIMBY problems all over the place. We like these things in theory, but please don't do it in Colonial Williamsburg, because we have a certain, set of ideas about how many people we want here, and parking's hard enough already, Right. So the NIMBY problems are real. We kind of all need to pitch in. I see a hand over there.
Oh, well, I'm going to catch this lady right here.
Hi. I'm going to take this off. So we can build these spaces. We can make a social infrastructure that's welcoming, but if we keep our noses in our electronic devices, then are we really being socially available for each other?
Well, I think that one reason that we love our devices so much is because they've developed them to be as addictive as possible. They really are smart about figuring out how to make us wonder, what did I? I've been up here for 45 minutes already. I have no idea how many posts I missed on Snapchat. Think about all the things my friends were eating at dinner tonight that I haven't seen. I'm going to have to wait 20 minutes to find out. Like, all the fried things are going to be cold by the time I see the pictures. But another reason that we're so tethered to the devices is because I think that we have failed collectively to figure out how to be together face to face and to make that rewarding and fulfilling. Like, I love to play tennis. I love to watch my son play soccer. I like kind of being outdoors and doing these physical things. And when I'm doing it, I notice that I don't think about my phone and my social media. And when I'm sitting at my computer, I think a lot about it. And so and when I'm by myself, I kind of want to connect to the world, and the best way I have is through these devices now. I think it's on us to figure out how to counteract the appeal and the power of the device by making places that are interesting, where we can experience pleasure. I just was talking to some folks over on this side of the room before we got here about this great sociological idea that comes from Emile Durkheim called collective effervescence, which is the idea that, like, when we're together in a room like this, like, you feel kind of the bubbling up of some social energy, this like power that sometimes becomes euphoric. It's a certain joy. We never feel this when we're on it. You never feel collective effervescence when you're on Facebook, And it's like, if you've been to a great sports game, you like these moments where it's like, wow, you feel your body shaking, Some people are really religious, and you get it in church on Sunday, Like, Durkheim was a sociologist of religion, and he actually was thinking a lot about ritual and kind of collective ritual and that feeling you get. You get it at music, concerts, you get it at clubs. Obviously, you get it at sociology lectures. So I think that I don't know anybody who says, oh my God, I love my phone so much. Like, I don't want to be in social life at all. I don't want to I just want to be here. My daughter's like that, okay? Even kids, like, they don't want the social media to be a substitute for the time they spend, the quality time they spend with other people. They want it to supplement it. And I'll give it to younger people. They're better at layering in the phone world and the human world, the face-to-face world. They're better at that than I think we old people give them credit for. There is more interesting face-to-face stuff happening. But the way that we're going to kind of win in the real world is not by cutting off access to the internet. I think the way that we produce more quality interactions is by figuring out how to make better experiences. And that's not an easy thing to do, but it's my argument that a big part of that is figuring out how to build social infrastructure that works better.
I just want to echo the gratitude that we all feel for your being here. Thank you so much. In the book, you point to a lot of different kinds of things. You talk about schools, you talk about green spaces, all these other kinds of things. And I was wondering, the way that much new housing in a lot of places is built now. I used to live in Florida, now I live here. A lot of housing is built is in developments that are by developers, and the local governments, instead of having public parks, the parks are part of homeowner associations and that kind of thing. And there's a given range of costs and so forth. And I'd just sort of like to hear you talk a little bit about, if you have any thoughts about homeowner associations, property owner associations, and their relationship to social infrastructure in a broader community.
Well, I'm probably not going to shock you with my response to that question, but I mean, here again, it strikes me that those kinds of developments are a mainstay of, the American real estate world, and in fact, it's not just American. I'll take you to any, Asian nation now that's developing and building out, and you'll find this similar kind of thing. What you can do as a local government or a state government is you can create conditions for getting, certain kinds of land use. And so, in the same way that if you want to build a certain kind of private development in New York City, you have to have a certain amount of public space. You can, as a county, I think, or state, have requirements about the kinds of land use that you commit to in exchange for building this private space. So this doesn't solve our problem, because if you have, say, a really exclusive community that builds first-class, internal park system and outdoor space that can only be used by residents, and then they throw together some, whatever second-rate public space for everybody else, you still have the problem of class segregation, right? And you still have a hierarchy. So it doesn't solve it, but it's a minimum for what you have to do. You can't just kind of get rid of the public sphere altogether. And I think I take your question to be a comment also, which is it's a dangerous way for us to be building out.
I read the book, and I wonder
Yes.
about the.
All right. You're all talking about like you survived some total hardship, by the way. It's like, no one's like, oh, I was swimming in your glorious prose, and I've been so sad. It's like, yeah, I read the book. I got the assignment. So thank you, but come on.
Since it
should have been a
written-
pleasure for you.
Since it was written 4 years ago, I wonder about how things have developed, especially that in Lower Manhattan, the project you talked about.
Oh my
Where does
God.
that stand now?
Yeah, it's bonkers. It's this NIMBY thing I just talked about is real, and also democracy is very, very hard work. I don't know if you know that. It's very hard work. So what happened? Okay, so there's a part in the book that's about this project on the Lower East Side, which was the big, shining winner of the Rebuild by Design competition, and this is Bjarke Engel's plan for the Lower East Side. And for those of you who are not architecture geeks, Bjarke is this starchitect, Danish architect, with a big firm around the world, a big office in New York, and they built this kind of fantastic park. They had developed a plan that was on the East River, which is an important location, kind of Lower East Side of New York, and it's important because often when you're going to build a climate security project and you're going to try to do flood protection, you build it in the wealthy neighborhoods. Like the powerful people use public resources to get themselves more security. And there's a long history of this, but it happened that the political leadership was more progressive, and they designated this like Lower East Side as a priority zone, and they built along the East River what they called a bridging berm, or they designed a bridging berm. It was like a sloped park that was going to operate like a sponge, so that when storm surge came into the city from the East River, instead of flooding the public housing, and tearing up the infrastructure, taking out the electricity, which is what happened in Sandy, it would kind of lap up into this sloped berm that was a park, and the park would absorb it. And it took years to put the design together and get community support, and there were some difficult issues, and then we overcame them, and at the last minute a few years ago, right before they were about to break ground, Mayor de Blasio announced that his engineers had looked at the plan and it didn't actually work because it was going to be really expensive to repair the park every time it flooded. And so instead of using the bridging berm, they were going to do it more like a conventional wall. It was going to feel like a wall, and then it was going to be a flat park, and it was still going to be a park, and it was still going to be very cool. And the idea is that when you're going to build climate security, climate infrastructure, it can also be social infrastructure. That was a big thing I emphasized for the design teams. That's the thing I'm most proud of, is that we have all these climate designs that were not just going to work on the one day a year that there's a big storm, but 364 days a year they're going to be great social infrastructure that make everyone's life better. But when he did that, we had promised for years that there was going to be this community participation, collective design, and it felt to a lot of people who lived in the neighborhood like he had just ended it. And so there was a backlash, and it was done by very smart people who, were largely white and had lived in the East Village for a long time, and they used the language of environmental racism and also kind of ecological sustainability. They were upset because the new park required cutting down trees. But then, so they started to protest the plan, and then this wild thing happened, which is that people who lived in the public housing clusters on the water, who were mostly black and Latino, said, actually, we do want the design, even though we don't like it as much. So then you had like white people calling out the city for environmental racism, black and brown people saying like, no, 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 we want it, and then lawsuits everywhere. And this is for like one of the best possible plans that you could imagine that had all this money. And so now it's the lawsuits, they lost the lawsuits, the plan, it's going, they're building it. And it's going to be good, but it's not going to be as good as it was before, and there's a lot of really bad feelings. And that's in the place that has more money and more expertise and more political commitment to do the project than just about anywhere on earth. And it's one little sliver of infrastructure in a world that needs to be rebuilt. So this is not going to be easy, folks, you know? And that's why I brought up this NIMBY point before. We're going to have to find a way to build differently, you know, and to be ambitious and bold. We don't really have a choice about that. We have to do it. So it's a pretty good story, but it's not the best story.
Other questions?
Yes, some of our social infrastructure places like libraries, public parks, museums, and so forth are the result of philanthropy, as you point out in your book and other places. And where our politicians fall short of vision or funding for social infrastructure, oftentimes philanthropists or generous people step into that void. It strikes me as an ironic connection that social infrastructure is somehow nurtured or enabled by a concentration of wealth and power among a few. Is that something you've reflected on?
Very much, and I don't think it's ideal. You know, we have a long history of these public-private partnerships in the U.S. and of philanthropy setting up government to be more successful than it might otherwise be. I mean, that's just a thing we've done here much more than in other countries. In my fantasy world, all of your personal financial contributions would be irrelevant or unnecessary because we would pay our fair share of taxes and we would have the collective capacity to make public investments in places that need it. And there's perversions that we get when we rely on philanthropy. Like, for instance, I live in Lower Manhattan. I'm not too far from Greenwich Village and the Meatpacking District and Chelsea and the whole High Line. And you know, I don't know if you've been to the High Line, but it's massively successful, you know, social infrastructure, and it's attracted billions of dollars of capital to that area. And so Google has built a park there, or is building a park there. And the Whitney Museum is there now, and it's building a park. And then you probably saw the glowing review in the New York Times of Little Island, which is our newest public space. It's what's the guy's name? Barry, I don't know, the internet guy. One of the internet guys. So we have like this one area where there are all these parks. It's like Park Gem Row. And it's not that any of the parks are bad. You walk in the parks and they're great parks. It's that, why are there parks there? Because that's where Google is. That's, you know, it's Diane Furstenberg's husband, whose name I'm forgetting. Barry Diller, thank you. You guys are pals. So Diane Van Furstenberg's husband, sorry. So the problem with philanthropy is it's like random. Where the money goes is random. Oh, I happen to love that street, so I'm going to build this thing. And that, you know, there are lots of communities that benefit from I guess it's not even that random, because people who tend to give money often not always give money to the thing that's like their thing. And so a place that probably doesn't need it as much gets more, and other places don't get it. Please give money to the Williamsburg Public Library. Okay? Okay. But you're not going to like me as much. But when you're done giving money to the Williamsburg Public Library, think about the poor town where these folks in the middle live, where they're really depleted and could use some help also. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah.